Salve omnes! Once again, it is Magister Compton, and we're talking about the cum clauses. So, what are cum clauses? These are clauses that always start with the conjunction cum, not the preposition cum that means with. And you'll know it's a cum clause rather than a cum plus the ablative because the next word after the cum won't be ablative, as it would be if it was a cum prepositional phrase. Also, the cum will usually come at the beginning of the sentence. Sometimes you'll see a cum clause mid-sentence like you do most other clauses, but normally when Latin uses a cum clause, it's going to be an introductory clause. There are four kinds of cum clauses. There's the temporal, the circumstantial, the causal, and the adversative. Okay. First kind we're going to look at is the cum temporal, and that tells the time something happens. So when that's the case, cum's going to mean when, and you'll know it's a temporal clause because the clause is going to use an indicative mood verb. So one of the few times, in fact, the only time this whole time of clauses, we've mentioned the indicative. That's the way verbs used to look. You know, the old amo, ama, samat, and ama, ba, ama, ba, sama, bat, you know, all that stuff. So if you see a verb like that along with the cum, you have a cum temporal clause. And it's just telling you when something happens. So cum means when. So here's an example. Cum Caesar in Galliam venet, principes erant aedui. When Caesar came to call, the aedui were the leaders. So, you know, what was happening when he came there? That's all this does. The second kind is a cum circumstantial, and it tells the conditions under which something happened. In this case, cum means when or whenever. And when it uses the subjunctive, which is typically the one the mood is going to use, it's going to use the imperfect and the pluperfect. You're not going to see cum with a present or perfect subjunctive be a circumstantial clause. So here's the example. Cum Caesar in Galliam venisset, aedui per moti sunt. When or whenever Caesar had come into Gaul, the aedui were alarmed. The reason why whenever works here is because, again, it's a condition, it's a circumstance that's in place that causes the next part. I'll be totally honest, though. I have myself had difficulty telling in English what would be considered a cum temporal and a cum circumstantial. The only way that I can tell apart in Latin is because, again, cum temporals take an indicative verb, cum circumstantials take a subjunctive either of the imperfect or pluperfect type. Really, that's about the only way you can tell the difference. If there's a distinction, it's so fine and minute that it's really not all that useful for you trying to figure out if an English statement would be one or the other. Fortunately, we're dealing mostly with the Latin, so we can tell because of what kind of verb we're getting. The third kind is the cum causal. And the cum causal tells us why the main clause happened. So in this instance, cum is going to mean since. And it can use any subjunctive tense. So an example of that, quae cum ita sint. You'll see this all the time. You may see it in past tense, quae cum ita essent, since these things were so. Doesn't matter, but this is a really common kind of cum causal. Quae cum ita sint Catalina, perge quoque pisti, egredere aliquando ex orbe. Since these things are so, Catiline, head to where you began, depart whenever from the city. This, by the way, is an actual Latin sentence from Marcus Tullius Cicero's first speech against Catiline. So yes, these do exist in the wild. They are real, and here's an example of one. But again, you know it's not going to be a cum circumstantial because it's using a present subjunctive. So not that a causal could use another tense. I mean, a causal could use imperfect or pluperfect, but normally when you encounter one, it's going to use a different tense. It's going to use the present or the perfect. If you're not sure, again, just kind of translate cum both as when and as since, and one of them is going to work better than the other. So that's how you can tell the difference if you're not otherwise sure. The last one is called the cum concessive, or as I learned it way back in the day, the cum adversative clause. And this clause indicates the outcome in the main clause is opposite what the cum clause would lead us to think would happen. So again, it's adversative because it's adverse, it's different from what the main clause is going to be. And we can spot this not only because there's cum with a subjunctive, but the main clause will almost always have tamen in it. Back on the old Latin 3 Natural Latin exam, that was always the way that they would signal a cum adversative. There would always be a tamen in the main clause. And when you saw tamen, just automatically cum men, although the end. Okay? This can use any subjunctive tense. There's no restriction on it. So how you would tell this from the cum causal, again, look for that tamen or something like it indicating nevertheless, yet, but, however, again, because it's going to show you different from what the cum clause is trying to express. So here's an example. Cum oppidum incendisemus ostes tamen fortiter pugnabant. Although we burned the town, actually we had burned the town, because it's a pluperfect. Although we had burned the town, the enemy yet fought bravely. Or nevertheless, the enemy fought bravely. So we have the main clause, the enemy fought bravely, even though the cum clause tells us something that might indicate otherwise. So although we had burned their town down, because that's how you intimidate people, it didn't work because nevertheless the enemy fought bravely. Okay? And so that's it. That's the cum clauses. So once again, temporal uses the indicative, the normal kind. Cum circumstantial is going to use either the pluperfect or imperfect subjunctive. The cum causal is going to use any subjunctive, and there cum is going to mean since. And here again, the cum concessive or cum adversative, where cum is going to mean although. And you always want to look out for that tamen or some other kind of word like that means nevertheless or however or yet to indicate that you have a cum concessive. All right, that's it. So if you have any other questions about the cum clauses, please let me know. We'll talk about this some more on Thursday in class. But until then, Valete omnes.